Welcome back to another DEAP podcast. I'm D.
And I'm Cast.
And today, last week we discussed drugs a lot, and I think that there were some aspects that we didn't really talk about in terms of the ethics of drugs. So I was wondering, last time was pretty good. Do you want to do drugs again?
Well, what do you mean by drugs?
So, recreational drugs.
Oh, well, yeah, we could do recreational drugs.
And we're talking podcast again, right? I know we had the same confusion last week, but I think let's start off with the definition of recreational drugs. And
Yeah.
Last week we started off the episode going into what is a drug.
Mhm.
What is a recreational drug, and why would you want to do a particular drug recreationally?
So, recreational drugs, when I think of a recreational drug, when I think of recreational anything, I think about doing something for pleasure outside of any sort of medical need or need in society to do so.
People may feel good about getting cured from cancer, but that doesn't make it a pleasurable experience.
Right. But with recreational, you are doing it for recreation. It's not explicitly needed to survive, and it's not explicitly needed to be in society, but it's something you do and you enjoy. So with recreational drugs, for example, smoking marijuana, it is someone doing smoking marijuana. If they're not doing medically, they're doing it recreationally, and they're doing it because they enjoy it. They like the experience.
It's based out of a choice and for the pleasure of the experience. Now, there's another aspect that you mentioned, which was to be able to survive. And I think that we'll be discussing that a little more in terms of withdrawal, because withdrawal can make you not want to survive. And if you're suicidal, arguably some drugs are necessary in order to keep you alive because of suicidality. So some drugs could be recreational and could be used medicinally. But I think for the purpose of this conversation, we can agree that antibiotics, while a drug, are not a recreational drug.
I would agree with that.
Okay, so what makes a recreational drug recreational is it has a positive impact on the way that you sense things. Is the aspect of positive necessary? Does it need to make you feel good?
I think it needs to start that way, at least. So making a comparison to other recreational activities. For example, I used to play soccer, and I very much enjoyed soccer. But does that mean I enjoyed every single soccer practice or every game? No, I didn't. So I think there is some give and take, but I think overall it should be in search of a positive feeling or positive feelings or a more positive view of the world, maybe.
Okay. I like where you're going with that, because there are a lot of other things that aren't drugs per se that can have a similar effect. So recreational drugs are a physical substance that can be taken to alter your perception on reality in some way. Generally speaking, it's in the form of making you feel good. But to my understanding, smoking pot is more of putting you into a more relaxed state so that you're more accepting of the world.
Yeah. And when someone smokes pot, I mean, it does depend on the particular strain, and the relaxation does play into kind of both in a sense, but the main two strains are indica and sativa. And I think what you're referencing is more of the indica, where it's the body high, and sativa is usually considered more of a mind high. But in both cases, I would say that you're either relaxing your body more or relaxing your mind more. But yes, a relaxation, just different aspect of you.
Sure. And with a lot of drugs, there's some complexity in the actual interactions that they have with your body. Alcohol is another good example of that. And so alcohol is a depressant, but it's also an inhibitor, and depressant in the sense that it will affect your emotions, but it also inhibits your ability to control your emotions and also to care. So
disinhibitor.
It inhibits your inhibitions.
Yeah.
So it amplifies inhibition, although against inhibitions. Anyway, one of the aspects of alcoholism that I find is interesting is that when you're drunk, it's not that you don't understand risks, but you're less likely to care about the negative consequences of those risks.
Yep. So that's why I want to say I don't. One of the things, and I don't remember our exact wording, but it's not always that drugs are done recreationally for pleasure, but
It's
for a
done.
positive impact.
I don't think a
So
positive
going,
impact. I think what I think the proper definition would be is done for a change in perception of reality. That the reason you take a drug recreationally is because it changes your perception on reality in some way. That is the probably broadest definition that we can take, or the most specific definition that we can take, that should still include all drugs that are
fair,
taken recreationally.
yeah, yeah,
So
and
let's
okay,
move forward with that as our definition. A
yep,
recreational drug is something that it's a substance taken for the purpose of intentionally changing your perception of reality.
yeah, I would agree with that, and I do like that definition, and I think most of the time it's with the intent for a positive, but it doesn't need to be.
Sure. So
So I do
for
like
instance,
that
or
clarification.
maybe not a positive, but a lack of negative. So painkillers and like the opioid crisis that's
Yeah.
going on at the time at the recording of this video, or recording of this podcast, the opioid crisis and the opioid epidemic is something that's going on that people that are afflicted by this are looking
Hmm.
to remove pain.
Yeah.
And so it's going from a negative stance to a neutral stance, which is why I think saying that it's positive, well, it's a net positive because you're going
Yeah.
up to a neutral. A lot
And
of
that's what
people,
I was intending, was a net positive. You don't need
sure,
to be in the positive to have had a positive impact.
sure. So painkillers, I think, are a good example that, you know, even if it doesn't affect your mind, I believe that opioids do to an extent, but the
Mhm.
primary effect isn't to affect your mind, it's to affect your ability to feel pain or really anything at all
Yeah.
physically.
Opioids definitely affect your mind.
Okay. Uh, but there are things that mostly affect your body
Hmm.
and not just your mind. And so
Yeah. I
affecting
mean,
your
local
body,
anesthetic, for example,
sure.
is a drug used that would affect only your body.
Hmm.
Um,
But I think it still very much fits within our definition of perception of reality, because if you
mhm.
can't feel things, that changes the way that you perceive reality.
Right. Exactly. It's
So
true.
I think
I think the original definition still stands that you made.
sure. So I guess the question that we brought up kind of at the beginning of this, which is do drugs, is what is the ethics behind
Yeah.
changing your reality? To what degree should you, and is it useful to change your reality? And I think let's start off with not people who are neutral, but people who are
Mhm.
already in a net negative. You have major, let's say, depression issues, or you
Mhm.
have an illness that you're constantly in pain.
Yep.
That's generally where drugs have a
So I
medical use.
will, yeah, I will say, like, we have the illness perspective, but that's not recreational then if you're doing it to treat an illness. Well, yeah, that's a gray area. So are you,
So
if you're
hold
doing
on,
it,
hold on.
yeah,
If I'm in pain,
yep,
my leg constantly hurts, I can live without it. And that's one of the things that you brought up earlier is,
hmm,
can you live without it? It's like, look, my leg kind of hurts a little bit. I could take drugs that make my whole body go numb. It's overkill. It's not medically necessary. There's no damage being done, but I feel like doing it to make myself feel better.
yeah.
It,
I mean, there are a lot of medications out there that are prescribed to make you feel better in a medical sense, but aren't absolutely needed to survive. And
and it's
so,
and particularly with painkillers, it's not even
yeah.
necessary for repairing. So, a lot of medication actually heals you. What a lot of, I think, recreational drugs, or drugs that can be used both medicinally and recreationally, they aren't healing you. They're just preventing you from feeling the bads. And I
Yeah,
think
for the most part.
that's where
Yeah.
opioids fit. Is they're not improving your condition, which is why
Hmm.
but they are preventing you from suffering from the negative side effects of it. At least
Yeah.
noticing the negative side effects, which is arguably both good and bad. It's good
Yeah.
because you're not in pain, and I think most people would agree that not being in pain is a good thing.
Yeah.
But there's inherently a risk in not feeling pain, which is if something bad actually is happening, or if it gets worse, you're
You
less
don't
likely
know.
to notice that or care about it, and you can end up doing further damage if you're on these
Yeah.
drugs.
And that's not counting the damage done by doing certain drugs, where you might feel a positive benefit, but you are significantly hurting your body or developing a dangerous addiction in the process.
Absolutely. And addiction is something that I think let's hold off on that for a little bit, but addiction is definitely going to come into it. But just
so where do we draw the line if someone is feeling pain and a doctor has prescribed them codeine, but the person does not feel like they get enough codeine, and the doctor is being stingy, and so they go and buy some from someone on the street, and now they're taking twice as much codeine. I mean, they were prescribed codeine in a medical sense, but they also got extra codeine from a different situation.
So
is that recreational?
I think in terms of drugs that can be used recreationally, which means that you're changing your perception of reality, to be able to go from a negative to at least a net neutral, what we should really probably be doing is saying, what is a minimum level of pain that is acceptable for people to have? So in other words, if you have a really bad affliction where you need painkillers to be able to function normally, we need to define what it is for a person to be able to function normally and use painkillers only to get up to that minimum. Because right now, if what we're doing is using painkillers to get up to the point of, oh yeah, I feel great all the time, most people don't feel great all the time.
Yeah.
And I think, especially to avoid addiction, like you mentioned, and related to the opioid epidemic, setting a point where you are actively still in pain may be necessary in order to make sure that you don't end up getting to that point of addiction.
Yeah.
And it seems weird because if the whole point of drugs is to eliminate pain, then you would want to eliminate all pain. But necessarily, if you eliminate all pain, then you reduce your ability to perceive the world and perceive reality. You basically go numb, which I think can be viewed as a net negative and a net positive, depending on what your reality is. If you have a very depressing life and you don't want to feel anything, you may view it as a positive. But in general, I think the inability to feel sensation is reducing your ability to perceive reality.
Yeah. And I mean, part of it we need to take into account is that sometimes when you're taking a drug such as morphine or or opioids in general, the goal is to have reduce your pain, but if you have major pain in one area, it may reduce that pain, but in doing so, you are completely getting rid of pain in another area or having a significant impact on your mental capacity.
Yep.
So there's a line to be, or there's not really a line, but an understanding that to eliminate pain to a comfortable level isn't always you can't always eliminate pain in only one area to that level without affecting others.
Right. You can use local anesthetic, but in terms of being able to have people apply it to themselves, it's generally easier to just take a pill that will give an overall numbness.
Right. I mean, the most prominent, or like the strongest form of local anesthetic is a nerve block, but in doing so, you are blocking the nerves. You can still control, like if you do a nerve block on your limb, you have no feeling in that limb, touch or pain or anything, but you can still move it.
Which is very dangerous. Because if you end up, let's say you're trying to prepare dinner and you end up using a knife, you can cut yourself and not even realize it, particularly if you're using meat. It's like, well, there's blood. Of course there's blood. And then you maybe feel lightheaded. So there are dangers inherent.
Yeah, you lean against the stove and you don't realize you've burned your hand on the burner and you've just left it there until you smell something.
Right. And we see the same thing in people that are very, very drunk. They're less likely to feel pain. Same thing when you're high on cocaine. I know I think Vietnam, occasionally a method that the Viet Cong would use is get super doped up on cocaine to the point where they just didn't feel any negatives. And it was probably it was very effective because they would continue running forward at the enemy until there were so many bullets in them that their bodies physically could not go through the motions because they just didn't
or
feel
they
pain.
Lost enough blood that they couldn't actually move the muscles anymore.
Exactly. So I don't think that that's an example that it necessarily fits most of our discussion because we're talking about recreation, but we're talking about the inability to perceive reality, that painkillers remove your ability to perceive reality. And it sounds like that becomes a problem because you no longer are able to interact properly with reality.
Yeah. So we like this. I think we need to cut this into pieces a little bit. Is there ever a time for even a small length of time where people should be able to kind of use recreational drugs as an escape? What are your thoughts on that? Should people, if they want to, for half an hour a day after they get home to help
Mm-hmm.
unwind, just do some drugs and feel good for half an hour and then continue on with their adulting?
So, generally speaking, and I think a rule of thumb that a lot of people follow is what happens between consenting adults is their own business. And
Mm-hmm.
if you are an adult, and like you said, you come home and you want to do some recreational drugs and you want to intentionally change your perception of reality, that is your prerogative. And I think
Yep.
that there's something to be said for that. That on a we talked about this on the last episode, is the point at which you should start prosecuting, or at least legally prosecuting someone for an action, should be done when the action is taken and when it is something that is illegal in and of itself. So drugs generally aren't illegal because eating it is harmful to someone. It's because maybe the actions that you take against another person, those would be illegal. And that's what we were talking about last week.
Yeah.
You can take cocaine, but it makes you more likely to commit a crime in terms of acting abusively. Same thing with alcohol. So if you act on those because of the influence of the drug, then you should be held more accountable for it. So I think
if your inhibitions are lowered enough that you do things illegally that you wouldn't have done sober, that's where it becomes prosecutable.
Yes. And I think, to answer your question, what is done between consenting adults is their own business. Generally speaking, I think that is fairly well proven to be defensible in terms of individual rights. Homosexuality. What business does the church have in interfering with the sexual lives of people that aren't Christians or are Christians and want to practice homosexuality? The argument against that regulation and against anti-gay regulation is that they are consenting adults. They can do whatever they want if they're not affecting anyone else, and or that they are only affecting voluntary parties.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in that way, drugs should be equally legal to homosexuality or any other act that a person can do without affecting another person, assuming that it's consensual.
Yeah. I would agree with that entirely. And I mean, there is an argument to be said about, well, if you are off doing drugs recreationally, you're not spending that time being a benefit to society.
So let's look at the interaction with society. There are laws currently, at least in the U.S., about public drunkenness.
Yep.
The idea being that if you're drunk, you're more likely to be obnoxious, and so being wildly drunk out in public can be against the law in certain places.
Yeah. And I mean, in many cases, if someone is walking down the street drunk but not causing any harm to themselves or the people around them,
or that they aren't noticeably drunk.
Right. And they're walking home. They're very, very drunk, but they're just walking home quietly. They get home safely and they go to bed. I mean,
there isn't anything
unless they're doing something to draw
that.
attention to themselves, I am doubtful that most police officers, even if they saw the person, would take the time there. But if they're running and they're screaming and they're like jumping into the middle of the road or like, pissing in a bush where people walking by can see, they're causing harm.
And I think that's a good example of prosecute the thing that's actually harmful and not the thing that makes it more likely for you to be harmful. Although maybe, like we were saying last week, maybe have them tied together so that if you are putting yourself in a position where you're more likely to be harmful to others, then prosecution may be different. But being drunk wouldn't be the crime. Being a nuisance while drunk is the crime.
Yeah, nuisance or danger.
Right. And I think that's why there are laws that aren't... There's an argument against that, though, that, okay, well, you want to be drunk in public. well,
Hmm.
I am around you, but just by being around you, I am affecting you. And
Yeah.
if my unaltered state, so if I'm not taking drugs, I'm still going to be affecting you. I might annoy you. You might
Hmm.
think that my personality or my voice is super, super annoying.
Yeah, and that's
That,
not going to change
but
if you're drunk.
right. And more importantly, it doesn't matter whether or not I'm drunk. If you dislike me as a person, that it could be equally annoying as someone who you do like that becomes drunk or afflicted by some other drug or high on another drug.
Yeah,
And
no
you
longer
could,
sober.
right, you could dislike me and that other person equally, even though one of us is sober and one of us is not. So, again, I think it's important to make the distinction that the action is what you would be prosecuting. But in that case, if the action is what you're prosecuting, then you can just prosecute anyone in terms of public indecency or public
Hmm.
drunkenness, public insobriety. You could punish anyone regardless of whether or not they're high. So I don't think that that's something that can be ethically defended, at least based on what we're saying here, because you can be just as annoying whether or not you're drunk.
Yeah, this is true. It's just it's hard to it's hard to do that. So if
I think the
if
important
someone
thing
is
is that
running if someone is running door to door, banging on doors, and they're found to be drunk, is
absolutely.
that wrong? I mean, if someone is running door to doors and was sober, I mean, it would still probably be wrong.
Right. I
um,
think it would still be potentially prosecutable, or at least you could get people involved to say, hey, stop doing this, which you, getting some sort of outside interference
mm,
may be justifiable. I think the point that I'm trying to make is being annoyed or disliking the state that someone else is in, if they aren't directly affecting you, is not problematic. So being around people who are stoned out of their minds and you disliking that is not a reason to outlaw
yeah,
the drugs. It's not a reason against the use
yeah,
of that drug. Doesn't matter how you feel about it, doesn't matter how anyone dislikes it or how much they dislike it. It is not directly affecting you. And
hmm,
when I say not directly affecting you, it's like maybe they're taking up they're super drunk or passing out and they're taking up a seat in the restaurant that you want. That's not
yeah,
directly affecting you.
yeah,
It is affecting you, but it's in a passive way. If it's
correct,
a person screaming in your face, that becomes different.
yeah. And I mean, there are arguments there. Like I agree with everything you said about like people, just because someone is drunk in public doesn't mean they're doing something bad in public. It does mean that they may be more likely to do something bad or unacceptable in public, but
Yep.
it's not like you are drunk in public, therefore you will go do something very bad.
Right. So it sounds like we very much agree that the dislike of in terms of someone changing their perception of reality using drugs
Hmm.
and the way that they're acting is only prosecutable in terms of how it affects another
Yeah.
person if it directly negatively affects them. It doesn't matter if the person dislikes the actions,
Hmm.
as long as those actions are taken between consenting adults,
Right.
their perception of reality can change.
So I want to step back to the original question I had because I think you covered a good point, but it wasn't really the intention of my question.
Okay?
Really, one of the arguments that I hear and I've heard going against the use of recreational drugs is if someone is high, they can't be contributing to society in a meaningful way. So let's say I come home and I uh, go out and I mow my lawn or I walk my dog and things like that. But instead of doing those things, I just come home and get high.
Sure. So is a mountain man, someone living way off in the mountains, completely self-sufficient, contributing to society?
Arguably, no, because he's not really a part of society.
Is he a detriment to society?
Usually also a no.
So he's neutral.
Yeah.
Should that be illegal? Should it be illegal to live off on your own because he's not contributing to society?
I mean, no. I don't think that should be illegal. I
And
think
then
it should be
I
if
think
someone can sustain themselves entirely on their own, then
mhm.
that should be legal as long as they're still within law. I mean, if you go do that on someone else's property and you are using that other person's resources
Oh,
that are
absolutely.
on their land,
In
it's
which
a
case,
different story.
the question changes. So someone not contributing to society is very different to someone being a detriment to society. Now,
Yeah.
I think there is a very good argument, kind of what you were bringing up, which is that when you aren't actively contributing to society, there is an exactly U-shaped hole in that society. It's a role that you could fill, that you could prop up all of humanity with your contribution, but if that's not something that you wish to do, it's your prerogative. And all of this is assuming that the individual's rights are paramount. That if you believe the rights of the individual are most important, then propping them up as you decide not to contribute to society, that's
Mhm.
your prerogative and it's your right. And in doing drugs, if you're just sitting there stoned out of your mind, if you're able to support yourself in doing that, you're not directly affecting others. Sure, you're not contributing to society, but I think that that's not really what people have a problem with. There are some people that will want the best for others and say, "Hey, you could make something better out of yourself."
Yeah.
And
And
that's a lot of times I think what
yeah.
parents are saying when they find out that their kids are druggies is they may say, "I'm disappointed in you." It's not because they think that the person is doing bad or their child is doing
Mhm.
badly. It's just that you could be so much more than what you currently are, and it's because of the drugs are what you're doing instead of being
I
something
mean,
more meaningful.
yeah, but the same argument could be said, let's say, against a child that is obsessed with sports and spends all day just watching sports and compiling like learning about the players, they are not very likely to actually get a job in sports world. Maybe they do, but if it is purely a hobby and they are just learning statistics about players and all they're doing is watching sports and just loving it, they're not really contributing to society. They're not really, they could be doing something else there. So why is there a different um,
Stigma.
a different stigma there about someone going home and just doing drugs and using that as an escape or
Sure.
a relaxation versus someone going home and watching a
And,
sports game.
I think it comes down to how it's actually used. So the other half of what I was saying is that we've been talking about not being a contributor to society. What about being a detriment to society? And I think
Hmm.
that this is where things change is that a lot of times drug use can lead to dependent drug use, and then you become a detriment on society. If you're using resources, becoming dependent on other people, needing to borrow money from people continuously that you generally don't pay back, you may very well become a detriment to society as opposed to a contributor or a neutral member of society. And I think that that's where things start to get really, really negative is when you become a
Hmm.
consumer of society. And since drugs are
When you consume more than you add.
yes, and so if you're, for instance, if you're on government sponsored housing
Hmm.
and you spend the little money that you earn on drugs, you are sucking on the government's teat while also using what you have to do drugs, in which case you are detrimenting the lives of other individuals to be able to spend money on your drug addiction.
So how is that different than using the little money that they have to buy a video game or to go buy a movie to watch or to pay for a cable subscription, something like that? What's the difference there in recreational choice?
The difference is that, well, between the drugs and the toys,
Sure. Yeah.
arguably nothing. And it depends on what you view as important in terms of dependency on the state. That
Hmm.
dependency on the state is not really dependency on the government, it's dependency on other taxpayers. And what we were saying earlier is if you are directly negatively affecting other people,
Hmm.
then you've stepped over the bounds and you are no longer just acting on your own volition. You're acting against someone else's rights, and you're interfering with them. And that is what taxes are. Taxes are an imposition on people, and when those taxes are redistributed to other people, it is a direct imposition on the people who are paying taxes. So if you are taking that money, you are imposing on other people. And whether it's paying for drugs or paying for toys or video games or sports cards or whatever it ends up being, if you are both using the little resources that you have for the purpose of recreation while also being a direct detriment to others by taking their money, even if it's through the government, that I think is arguably unethical because your habits are directly affecting other people.
So really what I'm gathering from what you're saying is that poor people don't deserve nice things, or they don't deserve to be happy at times, or deserve to have an escape in whichever form.
That is close to what I'm saying, but I think a slight misinterpretation. You don't need money to be happy.
Correct, but it helps.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't need money to be happy, but it helps, and I agree with that. But for folks, there are folks that are in a worse position than others, and by having less money, you have fewer choices in what you can do. If I have $1 million, there are a lot of things that I can choose to spend that money on that will make me happy. Saying that a person with $1 million deserves their choices more than a person with $50,000 is the same as saying a person with $50,000 deserves their choices more than a person with $10,000. So basically, when you are poor, the number of choices that you have and how to become happy is drastically reduced compared to someone with in the medium income bracket. So do they deserve happiness? Who deserves happiness? You can be rich and be miserable. You can be poor and be happy. It has nothing to do with whether or not you deserve it. It has to do with your ability to do it. And being poor.
So
and
I will say happiness is one thing, but I mean, I think everyone has their own form of an escape. And
sure.
if you spend the small amount of money that you have for spending money on an escape, that's wrong. That's what you're saying.
What I'm saying is that your escape should not be dependent on other people. If I am sucking on the government's teat and spending the few resources that I have for drugs, then I am actively taking money from other people to be able to spend on what I choose as my escape. That would be, and you are spending other people's money. While, you're saying, I get my government paycheck and I get my work paycheck, I'm going to use my government paycheck for housing so that I don't use those people's money for drugs. It's like, no. Mm-hmm. The reason that you're able to spend your own money on drugs is because other people are supporting what the money should be going to. The money should be going first towards your critical needs of keeping yourself alive. That means housing, food, and warmth. That's where your money should be going first. And if that isn't where your money is first going to, then you are actively taking it from someone else, which is a direct imposition.
I mean, you're not wrong, and viewing it purely logically, this is true. You are using someone else's money and then using your own money for yourself. I mean, that is part of society.
The reason that you're able to use that money for yourself is because someone else is actively propping you up by giving you additional money. And that's one of the reasons that people are very against.
In much the same way as taking care of an elderly parent or a sick parent, where they are being mostly an imposition on you.
That's voluntary.
And voluntary. I mean, a lot of taxation, although not immediately voluntary, it is. You get to choose how your taxes get used based on who you elect into office, how you have a say in things.
In terms of the elderly, if you are taking care of your parents and you're actively taking care of your parents, that is your prerogative. That's your choice of whether or not to engage in that.
Mm-hmm. And how is that different than me voting for someone, or someone in general voting for an elected official that is going to support Medicare and Medicaid so that my money and arguably everyone else's can be redistributed to that same type of group?
I want to bring it back towards drugs because that is the topic that we're
Yeah,
aiming at.
correct.
Because
Yeah, we can bring it back to drugs.
the ethics of how long should we take care of the elderly is a completely different conversation.
Yeah, and
I
also,
think
I
I
mean,
think
we were touching a bit on like universal basic income and more socialist things, so I think we can cut it back to drugs now.
Sure.
We definitely went on a tangent there.
Yeah. So, give me. Okay, so let's back up to the point of your ability to use drugs as an escape, because that's really where this started, is to what degree do you have the right to use drugs as an escape? And assuming that using drugs is okay or acceptable so long as you're not affecting another person, if the reason that you are able to spend money on drugs is because someone else is supporting you involuntarily, then that is an imposition on another person, and you don't have the right to do that. That's the point that I've been making for a little while, is that, yeah, you have the right to use the resources that you have as you see fit. And if that's one of the other conclusions that we came to with just doing drugs in general. Between consenting adults, they get to decide what they do, and if that's doing drugs, okay. But it's the imposition on others for you to be able to do those drugs is the part that's a problem. And I think that taking other people's resources for basic support, so basic housing and food, if you are getting that level of support but still putting money elsewhere, the money that is going elsewhere should have gone to that basic support. You need to be able to take care of yourself to earn the ability to make choices, including drugs.
So people, yeah, I feel like I'm going to go on another tangent here.
I can sum up the concept very easily,
Yeah.
and you don't have to put words in my mouth. If you don't have the ability to pay for food, you do not deserve the choice of being able to buy drugs or other things that make you happy. Or more specifically, if you do spend money on those things, you should not expect anyone else to be obligated to give you food or housing. And by the way, this is something that is acted out actively by people. They'll live in the streets, and when money is given to them, they'll spend it on drugs instead of saving it up for a home or for food. That's their prerogative.
I mean, that's regularly because of addiction and not always a choice on their part, or it is a choice, but it's the
addiction speaking. Yeah. Sure, but it's still their brain. It is their addicted brain, but it is the brain of that individual consenting to the choice of spending money that was given to them on drugs rather than getting food or a house. That to them, drugs will give a better relief than food.
Mm-hmm.
And that's their choice. I think that people have the right to make that choice.
Dopamine release when they do drugs than when they eat for sustenance.
Right. And interfering with that and saying, no, you don't have the right to spend that on drugs. You don't have the right to spend, or you have to spend this on food, is, I think, equally bad as just forcing a decision in general. If someone voluntarily gives that person money and they have resources, it's up to them to spend it.
Mm-hmm.
And if they choose to spend that on drugs, it's because it will make them feel better. Even if it's because of the addiction, it will make them feel better. As a society, I think arguably it would be good for us to help out those people and get them into a different position. But that also involves them taking the choice of saying, yes, I want your help, which also implies giving up their ability to choose drugs if they're getting the help. And I think we discussed that and in the last podcast, is to what degree do you give up your right?
Yeah.
So I think we've basically transitioned into talking about addiction, because addiction plays a lot into it. For recreational drugs that are addicting. So let's switch over to that topic, like officially switch over to that topic, that are addicting.
So We can switch over there. I kind of wanted to talk through some of the different effects that people seek when doing recreational drugs, because not every drug is the same and not every drug is going to have the same effect.
And do we
Um,
want to do that before addiction?
and because I think doing that in advance of addiction, because certain effects are the like have the actual chemically addictive
Okay,
properties,
sure.
and others don't.
Okay, go for it.
Um, so when I think about why what people are searching for when they do drugs outside of like the term escape like we've been using, but are they looking for a body relaxation? Are they
A
looking for
particular effect.
you're right,
And
and whether that be relaxation of the mind, relaxation of the body, seeing colors or things like a
sure,
psychedelic
sure.
effect where
I,
you see things more bright and vibrant.
and I think that this could probably be separated into some very broad categories. I'm going to take a stab at it.
Mhm.
Numbness, which will help if I take a stab at it. Uppers, downers, so depressants and
Stimulants and
stimulants.
depressants. Yep.
Yep. Yeah, sorry. I swapped them. So numbness, stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogenics. I believe that pretty much covers all types of drugs in general. Would you agree with that?
So numbness, stimulants, depressants, psychedelics,
Hallucinogenics in general.
hallucinogenics. Um,
So, okay. No, we
so
can
yeah,
separate hallucinogenics and psychedelics. Psychedelics maybe change the way that your brain processes things.
yeah,
Hallucinogenics make you see or hear things that aren't there.
right, yeah. Like a psychedelic would just make a color more vibrant. The color still is there; it's just brighter and it's there. Yeah, it's brighter. Whereas a psychedelic, you might see patterns and things that you didn't see before.
And things may
You
start melding into each other.
right, or you hear sounds, noises that are definitely aren't there, but you can hear them.
Sure. So let's start off with the easy one, I think
Mhm.
numbness.
Yeah,
When people want to numb themselves physically from reality, I think that there's an inherent danger in that you don't realize what's when things are going wrong. That's the whole
physically
reason
or
that we have pain.
mentally.
Uh, Physically,
Because I mean, you can do a drug to be numb mentally too.
sure, but and anything that makes you tired will do that.
I mean, you can be numb mentally and not be tired.
Do you have an example of a drug that would do that?
Sativa,
So marijuana.
yeah, marijuana sativa.
Okay. That you even if something is wrong and that you're stressed out, it can make you
Hmm.
not care as much about those things that you're stressed out about.
Right. So if someone wanted to be able to like forget about the worries of the day and just watch a television show without needing to do that, they might um, smoke or ingest marijuana sativa, and go and sit on the couch and just watch TV for 2 or 3 hours, and take in the TV, but and not be sleepy, but be able to like numb themselves to the world around them, and be able to focus or like lose themselves in whatever they're doing, watching TV, watching a movie, or playing a video game,
Sure, which would be
something like that.
similar to just taking a physical action, taking a numbing agent to numb down
Right.
your senses so that you can just focus on enjoying the activity more.
Yeah. And so that's what I'm getting at is a mental numbness does not always mean a sleepiness. Sometimes it does, but it
Okay,
does not always.
and that's fair. It's I think more of facilitating an indifference to negative parts of your life or negative thoughts.
Yeah.
An
Yeah. So
indifference to
that's
negative thoughts. I think that's a good way of summarizing it. And I think that is arguably the easiest type of drug to justify. Because people, we've been saying, people are looking for drugs as an escape generally. That
yep.
particularly these numbing drugs is you're looking for it as an escape, that you want to get away from reality, and people do that with or without drugs.
Yeah.
People do that with I I want to bring
I
up
mean, people do that with video games.
people do that with video games. People do that with religion many times. That
Yeah.
when someone has something really stressful in their life, many people, particularly around the death of a family, may turn to religion, and that religion, depending on which religion you turn to, can drastically change your perception of reality. So if the problem with drugs is changing a perception of reality, then the problem is equally with religion, because it can very much change your perception of reality. But also arguably, any idea that is any idea can really significantly change your perception of reality. So are ideas equivalent to drugs in terms of changing your perception of reality?
I mean, ideas can be addicting.
Ideas can be very addicting. If people like this podcast, I would hope that it's because of the ideas that are contained within it. So,
Mm-hmm. I mean, how many people I know I'm probably not the only one that will find a new podcast and uh,
and
binge all of the
you
episodes.
usually stay because of the content. You don't stay,
Right.
man, I really like that person's voice. It helps. But if you don't care about what they're saying, you're not going to keep listening.
Right. And so that it's not, maybe not an addiction per se, but it is something that I will do often because I enjoy it, and I will binge it, which, may
Sure.
have a negative effect because I'm not doing something else.
Sure.
But
so I think hallucinogenics plays well into this as well, because hallucinogenics can change how you perceive the world. And I think that changing how you perceive the world it's important to draw that corollary to a new idea or a new religion, because people who have had drastic or deep religious experiences, it changes how they perceive the world. That if you suddenly believe that everything that's happening is because God has ordained it, it can completely change the meaning. It can change your emotional outlook. It can have a positive or negative outlook on life, but it's changing your perception of reality in a drastic, fundamental way. And hallucinogenics can absolutely do that. Some people who have taken hallucinogenics, I think like in the mid-1900s when major studies were being done on this, enough exposure to hallucinogenics left a permanent change in the person's mind.
Yeah, yep, and it does, and that's not always a bad thing. There have been studies that show the use of LSD or psilocybin, the active drug in psychedelic mushrooms or magic mushrooms, can change the way that your brain functions. And when a person that is undergoing extreme depression, even if they do it once and never again, there have been studies showing positive impacts on that person's brain long term from doing mushrooms a single time or doing LSD a single time, and it helps them for the rest of their life.
So it's kind of the flip side of the argument. In schools when you're taught drugs, not even once. In this case, on the flip side, drugs sometimes only once is enough.
Yeah, and I mean, you don't get the other positive impacts like the psychedelic, or you don't get the numbness.
But if you're looking for an escape or a way of changing your perception of reality so that you get rid of negatives in your life, you don't necessarily need a constant change or a constant influx of the drug. You just need it to help you get to that new point of perception that you're looking for.
Yeah, and there are definitely people out there that will try mushrooms or will try LSD just because they view it as a way to get a different perception. It's not always to lose an existing perception, but to gain a new one by changing the way that they are thinking, even if it's just during the highness and they don't have that permanent brain chemistry change that I brought up. That's often the case of LSD. Is it's someone looking to experience the world in a slightly different way, such that they can, have a different perspective.
Sure, and so, I guess going along with that, would you say it's about equivalent that seeking a drug can be viewed as similar as seeking a religion? Because seeking a religion will change your perspective, as seeking drugs will. And sometimes people will try and force religion on you. That is similar to forcing drugs on you, because the purpose of forcing a religion is to change someone's perspective. The purpose of forcing drugs is also to change their perspective, or at least to be able to change their perception of reality. Now, there's going to be ulterior motive involved. I think particularly with drugs, maybe you want to make money on the person, or you want to be able to manipulate them. But it's the same thing with religion. A lot of religions are based on donations, and they want to be able to manipulate what actions you take. So,
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily plan on bringing it up like this, but in that way, preachers are similar to drug dealers in the sense that what they are dealing is a change in perception of reality, and most of the time it's to people that want to hear it and just keep coming back for more. You know, in Christian teachings, you go every week, every Sunday. You want to go back for more.
Right. And so, I mean, in terms of drugs or in terms of religion, if you are really kind of diving in head first there, I mean, I know a lot of people that say they're religious, but they go to church and they just hate it the entire time. They don't get anything out of it other than it's more socially acceptable to be there.
And I've known people who do drugs, particularly smokers, that hate the fact that they smoke, but they keep doing it. So there's a lot of similarity there. And by the way, if you think that I'm saying, oh, well, I'm making fun of people that are religious. No, I've heard the argument that, oh, Jesus is my drug.
Yeah. And I guess I understand that you're not putting down religion with that statement. You're just giving it as an example of something non-drugs that can have similar effects. And really what people are looking for here is they want an experience that is totally removed from anything that they would normally encounter in everyday life. And whether you're doing drugs or you are getting really involved in religion or you are watching a really good movie or TV series,
it's an escape.
Person to person, there are subjective effects.
And I think that an escape is not necessarily the right word. It's a word that's frequently used that, I do drugs to escape the stresses of my life or something along those lines. But I don't think it's an escape. It's to change your perception to the point of tolerability.
So there's a difference. I want to say I wouldn't use it. I wouldn't use the term escape when talking about someone that's looking for a different perspective on life. Yeah, I would use the term escape when you are going for that.
There is a difference that I could seek out drugs, that I could be in a perfectly happy state, and I say, I heard that LSD can really change your perspective on things. I want to try that.
Yeah.
Sure.
So you're not trying to escape your life. You are just trying to get a different perspective. And the same thing with religion. People can become religious either because they are going through bad times and they need something to lean on, but sometimes they're not going through bad times. They're in good times or, at least neutral times. And they go to religion not to make things better, but to get that different perspective, to kind of become involved. Maybe it's as a community and be involved with a community, or to
new ideas in general. Just seeking out new ideas and new knowledge is a way of continuing to change your perception.
And a lot of times what you expect from the experience does have an effect greatly on how you actually experience it. If you go in to a drug trip and you're like, this is going to be a bad trip, I just know it, you're probably going to have a bad trip because you are putting that expectation in your mind and having an effect on how you feel things.
Sure. And same thing, if you go into church saying, man, I really hate church.
Yeah, you're probably going to hate it.
Right. And you're not going to be able to get the positives out of what's being offered.
Yeah.
So what we're saying is that drugs are equivalent to church.
In a sense, they are both used to get a perspective and possibly as an escape.
I think there is a difference between drugs and ideas in the sense that drugs are physical. Now, more specifically, they are consumable, that they are a resource that will run out. Ideas are much less so, that they can be reused. If I want to revisit an idea that I had yesterday, I can just think back to it and bring it back up again. So I think in that sense, ideas are more sustainable than drugs. Well, that's a weird statement.
It is a weird statement. I mean, but you're right. And there are like the ability to go back to an idea to explore it further
And
is
sharing it with someone does
yeah.
not cost a resource in the same way that a drug does. And I think that this is probably
I
one of the other
mean,
big points.
time is a resource.
Sure, time is a resource, but it also takes time to do drugs.
Yeah, fair.
So I think when people are saying don't do drugs, or saying it's better to follow these ideas, or oh, if you're having issues with depression, don't do drugs, you should change your outlook on life. It's going to be harder to change your outlook on life and harder to learn the ideas and internalize the ideas than it is to take drugs. But I think the important difference is that in most circumstances, you need to continue taking drugs to be able to have an effective difference, rather than once you learn the idea, that difference can be consistent. Now, and a counterexample to that is what you were mentioning with lasting effects of mushrooms, that it can actually change your brain chemistry slightly enough that you can eliminate aspects of depression permanently, potentially. And I'm sure that these have not been rigorously verified by the FDA, because generally speaking, they are against those types of drugs. But I think that assuming that that's true, and we're moving forward, I'm assuming that because there has been a decent amount of research as well in, I think, the 50s and 60s with psychedelics, that there can be lasting impacts on drugs. Those types of drugs are similar in solution value to the ideas, as opposed to constant consumption. So I think we should draw a line that there is a difference between drugs that require constant consumption and drugs that can have a one-time permanent positive effect.
Yeah,
and that
whether
those are,
that be a
those are
change in brain chemistry or just in the having a different perception that you can.
right.
Like, part of the idea is that if you get a different perception, once you have that once, you can kind of go back to that and use that to look at ideas in a different way.
Right, or look
And
at
that's
objects in a different way. If you are high on acid and I believe that on acid you can perceive shapes differently. So if you look at a table and that table starts to take a different shape and you perceive it in a special way, that can stick with you, and you can look at tables and chairs and furniture and other constructions in a different way.
You can become more creative, because if you see a table morph in a certain way and you're like, that is just a really cool way, and then when you are sober, you design that table and it looks really cool, and then people can have an experience, similar to the one that you had while on LSD, but without needing it, because you formed an idea, you created this idea while on it, and then you pulled that into reality.
Absolutely. And I think that we've been looking for differentiations between ideas and drugs, and I think that an idea is an idea can have persistence. Drugs that have persistence, where you take them once and then you're done, I think are similar in value to those one-off, to learning a new idea. And that is distinctly different from a drug that requires constant consumption to be able to maintain that changed perspective.
Yeah. And that is a big difference between how I view something like marijuana or alcohol comparative to LSD or magic mushrooms, is that if you want to get the effects of marijuana, you have to smoke it regularly. And I mean, to get certain effects of LSD, to get certain effects of psilocybin, you would still need to take it. You're not going to become psychedelic for the rest of your life, but you are getting
the effects
impacts.
Are lasting, and
some of the effects.
So I think let's continue drawing a correlation to religion. Taking a psychedelic that can change your perspective permanently, not in the sense of you literally see things differently, but your brain perceives the idea of things differently. That's similar in regards to a religious experience where I feel that I met God. Those drugs that have that sort of lasting impact that don't require regular taking, that's the equivalent. drugs that do require you to take them regularly, once a day to maintain the effect, something along those lines, is similar to going to church once a week.
Yeah.
That it requires upkeep, and it's more of, you're not solving the problem, you're just treating the symptoms.
So, I mean, upkeep, there are certain benefits that you can get from going to church and then stopping. Like, you don't lose the perspective you gain from going to church. Something like, to draw that line, you gain a perspective, but you can gain other perspectives too by continuing to go. And then you also have benefits like being a part of a community. You have benefits from, being involved in the community, doing events, or like meeting new people.
Absolutely.
So,
And doing drugs can also bring you into that community. In, I think, a lot of schools across the world, there's that group of pot smokers. It's a way of people associating with each other by doing the same thing. And so in that sense, again, doing drugs regularly is similar in some ways to church, because you do become a part of a community. And like with religious experiences, one of the reasons you go back to church is in hopes of finding another religious revelation or another religious experience. And that's a reason that people may continue doing magic mushrooms, even if that one experience has changed the way they perceive things. Having additional ones may have some added maintainative. It may maintain that change, and it also may slowly have an additive effect on the change of your perception.
Yeah. So then, in either case, there are short-term and long-term benefits potentially.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that needs to be taken into account with drugs, is what are the positive effects that you're getting? Because But
what are the positive effects, and how long do they last?
But most of what we've been talking about is changing of your ideas, changing of your perception directly, which would be hallucinogenics, psychedelics, and numbness. We still haven't really talked too much about uppers and downers, stimulants and depressants.
Yep.
So is this a fair point to bring them in?
Yeah, I think so. And I want to say that there are legitimate medical needs for depressants and stimulants, but we're going to be steering away from that for this conversation.
Right. We're focusing on recreational use, so it's not strictly necessary in terms of I can continue functioning as a basic human being without these.
If someone needs their Adderall or their Ritalin to be able to function as an adult and be able to focus on things while at work, that is a medical need. But if someone is buying Adderall on the street and going home and taking it because they like how it feels, that is not so much a medical need.
Yep, absolutely. Similar to marijuana, just being, because is marijuana a downer?
I believe it's considered a depressant. I think it has both depressant and stimulant effects, depending on exactly how
it's ingested.
There are different chemicals in it.
Right, and by the way, I believe that catnip is actually very similar in that regard, that depending on how cats ingest catnip, it can change whether or not it's an upper or a downer. I think it's whether or not it's eaten or breathed in. So I believe if they breathe it in, then they get really hyper and excited and will roll around, whereas if they eat it, they just kind of get more drowsy than a cat usually is.
Yeah. Yep.
So, the reason I bring it up is because, yes, drugs can be both an upper and a downer.
Mm-hmm. So, and, well, in a way, marijuana can also be considered a psychedelic. It has the capability, not always, but has the capability to change how you see things or how you hear things. It is possible that, depending on the situation, it could be a depressant, it could be a stimulant, or it could be a psychedelic.
Sure. And I think it's difficult to say what should be defined as what, because alcohol can make you more likely to do particular actions, but it's not a stimulant. it's a depressant in the sense that it inhibits certain aspects of your brain's functionality. It inhibits decision-making process. It inhibits your inhibitions, which makes you more likely to do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. But it also just depresses your ability to act. It increases your reaction time. As in, it slows it down. The time that it takes you to react increases, and in that regard, it is a depressant. A stimulant increases the rate at which your brain functions. Depressant decreases.
And so with marijuana, you can get things like if from a depressant point of view, you can be relaxed, or you become sleepy, or you might maybe feel dizzy because your heart rate slowed. But it actually can have stimulant effects at the same time, such as like increased body temperature. Paranoia is a big thing that you can definitely get on when you're on marijuana. Your heartbeat become irregular or sometimes speed up. You might feel relaxed, but your heart's beating very quickly. You can become anxious, and some of these are very much person dependent, but in all of those cases, you might have both depressant and stimulant effects at the same time. And at the same time, like a psychedelic or hallucinative effect that is impacting how you're seeing things or how you're taking an input, and in some cases, maybe making up input that isn't actually there.
Sure. So let's break it down by piece. What's the benefit to having a downer?
Relaxation is a big thing. You can more easily fall asleep if you're on a downer. You can more easily relax and kind of I don't know, maybe I guess the term escape is definitely there. Where
you can when your mind would otherwise be focusing on a lot of things and panicking, or in high stress situations, having a downer can reduce the load on your brain, particularly just in terms of stress. And so I think that's probably the primary use case
brain
for
or
a downer.
body.
Reducing stress on brain or body. Yeah. Which, drinking your problems away is the stereotypical example of that. I'm just going to keep drinking until I no longer care about this problem. And I think marijuana is very similar in terms of being used as a downer.
Yeah, in that case, it can be used in that way where you use it to not care as much about everything else going on in life.
Sure. And uppers, I think, are similar in the opposite effect of, if you would otherwise not be motivated enough to do a particular action. So, for instance, if you're tired all the time, or you just don't really have the energy to do something, and then you have a bunch of caffeine, because caffeine is a recreational drug, now all of a sudden you're more likely to take those actions. And I think that this is where a previous portion of our discussion should come back up, being a contribution to society. Being on uppers makes you more likely to perform actions and makes you more efficient and faster at performing those actions.
Use in wartime.
That's something that we didn't discuss in the last episode that I wanted to bring up.
I think we mentioned it, but we did not get into details.
In World War, I think at least one, possibly two, methamphetamines were given out to soldiers.
In the Civil War, opioids and poppy seeds were given out to soldiers. There were hundreds of thousands of Civil War veterans that came back from the war that were addicted to opioids.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just World War I and World War II, or like even that time frame.
Vietnam that I mentioned.
Right. Yeah, Vietnam was big, but hundreds of years now, drugs have been used in warfare.
And for the facilitation of more efficient warfare. If you have a soldier that can't feel pain, they will be more effective. It's also more risky because they may not realize that they need to get help, but they will still be a functioning human while they're injured, which is very, very important. So, and along with the methamphetamines, that if you see a gun blast and you have just enough time to move your head a couple inches from the time that you see that gun blast, if it takes you a quarter of a second to react, that bullet has now moved a quarter of a second's worth towards you. And if it takes half a second to hit you,
Hmm.
You now have a quarter second to actually physically move. If you can decrease your reaction time down to zero point 0.1 seconds, that gives you almost double the amount of time to
Yep.
move your head out of the way.
Yeah.
So I think that there is an argument to be made for using drugs, particularly stimulants, in warfare because it
In an
increases the.
active fight, yes.
Yes.
The downside is though, if you're not actively fighting, you have a chain of command, and when you're on a stimulant, you're more likely to go against that chain of command. You're more likely to kind of ignore orders and
Because you'll come up with ideas more quickly. It's like, no, I have an idea against that, so I'm just gonna try and find that because
I'm just going to
my,
charge in there instead of try to take this boring plan of walking around and slowly taking off the
sure,
combatants one by one.
absolutely. So I think that that's a great argument against it. Is you need
Hmm.
to maintain chain of command, but you also
Yeah.
want to increase reaction time. So, which is why I mean, coffee I think was also fairly standard issue, more so than methamphetamines, but
Hmm.
that is you are more alert, but not so much so that you're going to be ignoring orders. When you get to the
Right.
point of jitteriness, like where your hands are actually jittery, whether that be on
Hmm.
caffeine or methamphetamine, I think that's probably where you're more likely to start acting stupidly.
Right. And I mean, there's a reason that you're not allowed to um, drink coffee or alcohol in before you go to an event where you are like professionally shooting a gun. Is that they have an impact and are considered. Um,
Are you not allowed to drink coffee before
I
a shooting
I
competition?
I thought I've heard that. I know alcohol is not allowed because it does. If you
Alcohol
have
is,
just a small amount, you have it. It has a benefit to your reaction
yeah,
time.
you're not allowed to mix guns and alcohol. Um, I mean,
But this is for a different reason than usual arguments.
in
It's
and in competition, I don't know, but um, it gives you an advantage,
mhm.
and if you do too much, it can become problematic. And anything in excess is bad, and I think that drugs are a very good example of that. And caffeine is hard to overdo because yeah, you might be jittery, but generally speaking, it's not to the point of doing something problematic. Methamphetamine can very much get you to the point of I have a thought that came to my mind and I will immediately act on it. You know, people tend to be
Mhm.
fairly good at suppressing bad ideas. You know, if you're on an airplane and there's a kid crying really, really loudly, and you might just have the urge to, and I'll take a tame example, hit the kid in the face with a pillow.
Mhm.
It's like we get those urges, but we suppress them. If you're doped up on methamphetamine or some really, really intense stimulant, you may think, I hear someone crying. I don't like that. I'm going to act on it and I'm going to stop it. I need to stop it immediately and stop it as soon as possible. Whack.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's the argument against drugs that are too powerful, is that it makes you more likely to act before having the chance to fully think through it. Granted, it makes you think faster, but you're less likely to think through it because of that.
Mhm. Yep.
Now, I think that
It.
painkillers in particular definitely should be included so that if you do end up getting injured, you have the ability to reduce pain and continue
Mhm.
functioning for a short period of time. So I think using them as a just in case is
Yeah.
probably how it should be used.
Mhm.
Now, that just in case and just when necessary, let's take up the Viet Cong example that I brought up of cocaine soldiers. Get someone high on cocaine and so that they can charge at the enemy with basic impunity until their body literally stops functioning.
I mean, there's something ethically wrong with that, where you are basically guaranteeing the death of one human to cause a lot of damage.
That was
Which,
done on
I mean,
D-Day.
what is warfare? Yeah,
Yeah,
and I'm
and
not
we're
saying
getting way off on a tangent here, but D-Day was the same
yeah,
thing of saying, "Hey,
yeah,
you're basically gonna go die." It's the same. The drugs
yeah.
just facilitate their effectiveness in that, and
I
I think,
mean, there's actuarial science behind that of like how many people can we lose and still have this be a success? Because no matter what, we're going to lose people in war. That's just what
and
happens.
testing medical drugs is going to be the same thing. But that's not really what we're getting at. Is
Yeah,
to
yeah,
what
yeah.
degree is it okay to use recreational drugs to be able to execute an action, And it's really, I think, as long as there's no long-term effects, it's not problematic.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
When convinced
I
by
mean,
another person.
there are people that, even though they don't have an Adderall prescription, will take Adderall while studying for a big exam because it helps them focus. Whether or not they need it on a normal day, they're using it, in a sense, recreationally so that they can concentrate on studying for the exam
And I've
or
done
potentially
similar
staying
things
up.
with having
Yeah,
caffeine, and
yeah,
on a day that I have more work to do, I may have more cups of coffee
mhm,
if I want to stay more alert for a longer period of time.
yeah. I mean, and personally, as a non-regular caffeine user, I very maybe once a week at most will I consume something with caffeine in it. There are days where I need an additional focus, and I will take a caffeine pill that's roughly equivalent to 1 cup of coffee, and it has a major effect on me just because my body's really not
Hmm.
used to it. So
Yeah.
there are definitely days where I'll do that, but I would say in a sense that is still being used recreationally. Would you
And I would agree
agree?
with that. I think that the reason that uppers in that way aren't viewed negatively. So caffeine, I think most people would say, is not viewed negatively. Methamphetamine is. I think
Mhm. Yeah,
methamphetamine, because it's an upper in excess to the point where the person loses their ability to function as a normal human being.
yeah,
Caffeine allows you to function as a more effective human being for a longer period of time.
yeah. It has a reduced effect for a longer period of time, whereas
Yes.
methamphetamine and other amphetamines have a strong effect, but usually for a shorter amount of time.
Right. So I think for uppers, I think the summation of uppers is so long as the upper is only having an effect such that you are more effective than you otherwise would be, but you have not started losing the ability to function either with yourself or with others. So when we were talking
Hmm.
about the ability to follow orders and maintain the structure of command, that
Yep.
when you start losing those ability, then the drug becomes less useful and less practical.
Hmm.
Um, what now? This is very different. The downers and uppers are very different from psychedelics and hallucinogenics because while they do change your ability to react with reality, they change your perception of reality. So, to what degree is it reasonable to change your perception of reality? Are you okay with taking that turn in the topic? I realize I'm kind of bringing this up
Hmm.
mostly ad hoc, but
So, with with a stimulant or a depressant or a psychedelic or a hallucinogenic, you are going to be changing your perception of reality in some way, whether that be just in with a stimulant, an increased perception of maybe focus or of what you're currently doing, or with a depressant, maybe a decreased focus on anything going on in your life, so you can kind of just take in something that you enjoy more. Or, psychedelic and hallucinogenic definitely changes perception. So I'm interested in the question because it sounded like you were trying to say one of those changes perception while others or other does not. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that hallucinogenics can change not just how you interact with the world, but what you think the world is. Do you
Potentially,
understand the
yeah.
difference?
Yeah.
That
It's not enhancing. It's
taking
not enhancing your
caffeine
perception. It's adding to it,
is modifying it.
modifying it.
It-
Yeah,
put I know there's like drunk goggles or
yeah,
what simulations or artistry of motion pictures that say this is kind of what things look like on LSD.
hmm,
Look up Google, I think Deep Dream.
hmm,
They're creepy, but it images and lines between things more flow together,
yeah.
and
And you,
that's
yeah,
something that can really change just what you think reality is. And we were saying that earlier as a potentially good thing, that you changing of reality isn't problematic because ideas do that. Your reality is constantly changing.
hmm,
So and I think another one of the arguments against drug use is you are detaching yourself from reality. And what is the difference between changing how you perceive reality regularly and detaching from reality? And is that problematic?
Um, I would say not inherently. I think either is acceptable when done in the right situation. So if you want to change how you perceive reality in many cases by kind of reducing your normal capabilities, like when you are high on LSD or psilocybin, you are experiencing reality differently, but you aren't capable of doing a lot of things you normally would be. So as long as
Right.
you are doing that in a safe and controlled manner without having a net negative impact on you or those around you, then I think that's acceptable.
And I somewhat agree with that in terms of not having a negative impact on other people. I think that's good. But what I was saying earlier is there's a difference between changing your perception of reality and detaching from reality. And I think the problem with detaching from reality is you lose the ability to successfully interact with reality. That is problematic, both in terms of drug use and just bad ideas. A bad idea is one that doesn't mesh well with reality. That when you act based on an idea that is wrong or isn't based in reality, then you lose the ability to interact successfully with reality. This is one of the I guess, philosophical theories behind bad luck. If you have an idea that, oh, I just have bad luck, it's probably more along the lines of you have beliefs about the world that cause you to act in such a way to get bad luck or to have negative things happen to you. If the way that you interact with the world means that negative things happen to you, you're just going to attribute it to fate. It's actually attributed to how you're interacting with the world. So with drugs, one of the big problems with them is an ability to change your perception of reality can very quickly become a detachment from reality. And when you are detached from reality, you lose the ability to interact with reality in a way that is not just productive, but cohesive.
Yeah. So think about it like this. I mean, I've touched on this a bit before, but you can detach from reality without drugs. You can, like watching a good movie, you've detached yourself from reality and kind of lost yourself in the
Yeah,
experience
when
of
you
the
lose
movie.
yourself in the story.
Yeah. So where do you draw the line? Like, why is it wrong to be able to detach yourself from reality in terms of a movie? Is it just because you could be pulled back into reality
I
easily?
don't think it is. I actually, so that's a good portion of it is the ability to pull oneself back. If you're
Mhm.
watching a movie and all of a sudden you hear a gunshot outside, most people are gonna stop the movie or start paying attention to what else is going on around them
Mhm.
and try to catch their bearings, and they can change. If you are drunk out of your mind and you hear a gunshot, you're not really going to be able to successfully interact with that. You lose your ability to interact with reality. And interacting with a particular idea, your brain is still able to snap out of that idea and interact with reality again and deal with it.
Mhm.
With drugs, you can't. And there are some exceptions to that. So, for instance, with opioids, there
Yeah.
are medications like Narcan that just immediately
Yep.
get rid of your high.
Yeah. An naloxone kit will immediately remove your high.
But most people don't have that because, well, why would I want to get rid of my high? If I hear
Yeah.
gunshots and I don't care, why do I want to start caring about the gunshots?
Yeah. And I mean, the ability to exit your detachment, I think,
The
has
ability to reattach to reality, I think, is important.
at,
And
at will.
yes, at
Yeah.
will and without other outside interference. And drugs don't have that ability. And in that
Hmm.
sense, drugs detach you from reality. There are some drugs that change your perception of reality, but because they are persistent and it's just until the effects wear off, ideas you can change what ideas in your head.
Hmm.
Drugs, you can't just eliminate them from your body right away. It takes time, which is why drugs do can have positive changes by changing your perception of reality, whether that be helping with stress relief, helping with getting things done, or just changing your perspective on things. The problem is that you can't control that change, and it necessarily temporarily detaches you from reality. And I think that's probably the biggest argument against doing drugs that change your perception of reality, is that through changing your perception, they detach you from what is real. And most importantly, the reason that that's bad is detaching from what's real prevents you from being able to successfully interact with reality and the outside world.
I mean, that is true, but there are, I mean, we've covered positive
And
benefits.
not all
of
drugs do
doing
that. Caffeine doesn't necessarily prevent you from being able to
right.
interact with the world, but that's why
Does
caffeine
it
is
change
accepted.
your perception? Does it, I'll give you a different perspective on life, like psilocybin or LSD would. And the answer is no. But there are benefits there, and I mean, you do have to wait for the drug to wear off before you can kind of seek some of those long-lasting benefits. But there's give and take here.
Sure. And let's look at it from consistency, that a lot of drug users are consistent drug users. And it may not be because of addiction. It may just be because they have an interest in that particular drug or that particular feeling.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I've known many drug users through my years. Some
and
of them are...
a lot of them are not bad people. Some of them are,
right.
Some of them aren't.
Yeah. Yeah, but there are wide varieties. There are people that I know use drugs because they are addicted, and they do end up being a detriment on themselves or society. And then there are other people that do them kind of as needed when it isn't going to be a detriment. They go home and they relax, and they do something. In some cases, maybe a few times a year they do it, but it is entirely by choice. It's not because they feel a need to do it or an addiction, but whether that be for an escape or just to perceive things a little bit differently for a time. It's there, but there's a wide range here about people. What I'm getting at is, how do you define a regular user? Is that someone that uses it daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly, or a few times a year? What is regular?
When someone uses it on a very predictable basis, that it becomes a regular part of their life. So I would say on the order of daily to weekly.
So if someone goes out and drinks with friends every Friday right after work because it's a social event,
that's regular. If there is, I would say predictability, but saying I drink one time a year on Christmas or something along those lines. That someone who goes to church only on Christmas and Easter, they don't go to church. If someone goes to church every week, they go to church.
Yeah.
So,
or almost every week, however it falls. But
right. Yeah. So I think it's similar to that. So I'm talking about consistency, where at any given day when I'm interacting, or any given week, any particular regularly refacilitated interaction that isn't a one-off like a holiday, would I have expected this person to have done drugs between that interaction and the next type of similar interaction? So in other words, one-off things like the holidays, or we're having a family reunion, those are not regular events. And so if those are the only times that you do a particular type of drug, you're not a regular user. If you are using it predictably and not associated with ad hoc events, then that to me is persistent drug use or regular drug use. So going out with friends every Friday, even if it's every other Friday or maybe every third, it's still fairly predictable. It's regular. And I'm trying to remember where I was going with this. The idea of regularly using drugs is regularly detaching yourself from reality. And that makes you overall, as a whole, less able to function with reality and makes you less effective as a person. Now, as long as you're not affecting other people, it doesn't matter if you're a contribution to society. It matters if you're a detriment. But here's an ethical argument against regular drug usage, particularly drugs that detach you from reality. If I am regularly detaching myself from reality, and other people all other people are also regularly detaching themselves from reality, the number of people contributing to society goes down, and that brings all of humanity down with it. So the regularization and the standardization of regular drug use tends to create less contributions to society under most circumstances. I'm talking about ones that you aren't productive while on the drug. So uppers are maybe an exception to that. But in terms of hallucinogenics, it's like you might be artistically productive, but I think under
artistically productive is productive for society.
Sure. And sure, that's fine. Let's focus on depressants or things that reduce your willingness to act. And a lot of hallucinogenics do reduce your action, or how much action you're willing to take, while also giving you the hallucinogenic effect. But it also affects your ability to interact with reality itself. It changes your perspective, but if it becomes to the point of detachment, you lose the ability to properly interpret the world in a viable way that is coherent to what reality is. And in that case, it prevents humanity from moving forward. And in that case, yeah, go ahead.
What it sounds like you're saying, and do correct me if I'm wrong, but if it kind of sounds like you're saying if you're not always adding to society, then you are taking away from it.
Kind of, to a degree, yeah. And I mentioned that earlier on of when you don't contribute everything you can to society, in whatever way that may be. That may be entertainment, it may be artistry. I'm not saying you need to produce materials. No. I'm saying if you aren't contributing what you can, you're leaving an exactly you-sized hole in society.
So
the point that I'm bringing up about drugs is that drugs make it very easy to make that detachment and reduces the likelihood of you making that contribution.
So taking someone, for example, that goes to work 8 hours a day and contributes there and does a job that they feel is, it does add to society.
If they're able to use drugs to maintain that contribution, so for instance, with stress relief, and they can continue contributing to society, then yeah, absolutely. They are, that point is null and void in a particular way, that maybe they could be more productive in a different way, but if even if a depressant makes them better able to cope with the problems in their life and makes them more productive, then drugs that would otherwise have a negative impact can have a positive impact. Yeah. But I think the likelihood of abuse with drugs is much higher than that with ideas, because ideas most of the time
it's not as easy to get high on an idea though.
Exactly. And since it's not as addicting in general, I like accruing new knowledge, but it's not. It's not the same. And it's not the same type of drive that you see in someone who's addicted to meth. I'm not going to my library saying, "Oh my God, I need this book. Give it to me now."
Some people do.
Yeah,
I've seen people get irrationally excited about new books and new ideas. And to be fair, like I have gotten a new idea in my head, and I spend an entire evening looking into it and being really excited about it. And suddenly it's 5 a.m. and I've got to wake up in a few hours.
And then you have to share it with someone. And I totally get that. But that is, I think, much harder to do, rather than I'm going to take a pill that's going to put me into a hallucinogenic state. It's significantly easier to get into those states and consistently remain in those states with drugs so that you never get out of them to continue contributing to society. And whether or not, is it wrong to not contribute to society? No. It's wrong to be a detriment. But not contributing to society, if everyone stops contributing to society, society stops. And I think if you stop because of detachment from reality through the ease of drugs, and drugs being problematic because of how easy it becomes to detach yourself from reality and not be able to get back into reality, the point that I was making about watching a movie, you can stop watching the movie. doing drugs, you can't stop being high immediately under most circumstances.
So, I mean, there are valid points that you're making, but I feel like you're falling very strongly into a slippery slope fallacy,
Okay.
where like,
I'm
sure,
saying that I'm not saying that it will happen. I'm saying that there are
hmm
dangers involved with it,
hmm
which people who tend to be against drugs are saying there are dangers in this drug. Not it doesn't mean that it's guaranteed to happen, but there are dangers associated with that. And in order to avoid those dangers, we should outlaw all drugs. Don't allow drugs. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying
hmm
that there is an argument to be made that drugs are dangerous, and I think it's the detachment from reality that makes them dangerous. That's the argument that I'm making.
hmm
Do you agree with
And I
that?
mean, I would generally, yeah, I would agree with that. I just was pushing against your statement of if one person is doing this and then everybody is doing this, then
It,
there's no societal growth, and that is the slippery slope that I
let me
wanted to.
defend your position against
Yeah.
my previous position, uh, and bringing up religion again. People can be convinced to kill other people through religion. Religion has, for thousands of years, convinced people to kill other people. Arguably, that's bad. So, because it can have a negative effect, then should we just, not have religion or outlaw religion? Well, that doesn't really work. And it's the same thing that just because something can be negative doesn't mean that we should outlaw it. Ideas are difficult in that regard. Similarly, because some ideas are really, really, really bad. Some ideas can lead to tens of millions of people dead. Socialism, communism, hint, hint, wink, wink. And so should those ideas be outlawed? And I think equivalently to drugs, that if something is proven to have a constant negative effect, should that be outlawed? So for instance, if there's a drug that has a positive effect on one person, but it causes them to always uniformly be a detriment to society. And I'm not talking about neutral, that it consistently makes people be a detriment to society. Should those types of drugs be outlawed?
That's,
Because you're preventing things that are problematic to society. And
I mean,
that's what you do in a society.
if you had a drug that was an absolute guarantee to be a detriment to society, then yes. But there aren't, it's not as clear cut with just about any drug. Heroin might be an exception to that.
I think heroin might be an exception. Crocodile, I would argue,
Oh,
is also.
yeah. Yeah.
So
But
I mean, there you go. And by the way, the reason that I say I think crocodile is a really good example for those of you that aren't aware. Look up crocodile.
gasoline and
I think it's gasoline and
uh
paint thinner, and then you inject it into your
yeah.
arm, something along those
Yep.
lines.
And
And
then yeah.
and look up crocodile.
Don't look it up if you have a queasy stomach, don't look it up.
Oh no, absolutely not. I'll do a brief description. Basically, they're solvents. They dissolve things, and when you start injecting it into your arm, it dissolves your arm to the point where bone is exposed to air. So
Yep. And it dissolves your arm from the inside. So
yeah,
it's
not a
pretty.
good drug. But because of that, there are necessarily, that's what it does. It has negative consequences in terms of the medical industry, that these people need to be taken care of. By the way, the average life expectancy of someone that starts using crocodile is about 2 years from when they start. That's a detriment to society, not just because you're not contributing. It's a detriment because you become a burden on the medical facilities trying to keep you alive and trying to repair you. And if you're spending your money on drugs, or if you don't have the ability to pay and you're just going in with emergency care because, oh my God, my arm is literally falling off. At least in most countries, I think there's ethics rules of you must get someone to a stable medical condition if possible, regardless of their ability to pay. So there you're being a detriment to society, in which case that sort of drug should be illegal to use because it's going to lead you to be a detriment to society. So I think crocodile is a perfect example of that.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, if it is a drug that is an absolute guaranteed detriment, then yeah, I think that should be illegal. But a lot of drugs are
To
have the
where
ability
is that
for
threshold? If 90%, and I guess we don't need to decide what the threshold is, but
yeah.
if
I think
90%
I'm
of
gonna say if the
all users are,
majority,
so over 50%,
yeah,
if over 50% of regular users of a particular drug are overall net societal vampires, let's say, that
hmm
they have a net negative effect on society, that means that the drug is majority bad and should be outlawed for recreational use, even if it is used in some cases for specific medical needs.
hmm yeah, I would. I think I would lean towards that. As far as who has to determine which people and which users are in net negative and net positive or neutral, that is a little bit more, but I don't know if we have to get into that. If you can legitimately say a drug is, for the most part, causing people to be a net detriment to society, then yes, it should be made illegal or at least at a recreational level.
And I think that that can be arguably difficult to justify, because
Mm.
in the guilty innocent until proven guilty, if I haven't done anything, and if I can hold my drug, if I can hold my alcohol, I don't care
Mhm.
if 50% of people
Yeah.
that do alcohol end up committing a crime. I am able to, because I'm able to do it responsibly.
hmm And that's valid. Yeah,
And
I
and
think there is an argument there if you were to take into court with a drug that is, well, I mean, if you're taking to court and the drug is illegal, then you don't have much of an argument there until it is legal. But
sure. So
um,
so I'm gonna do a quick tangent because it
mhm.
came up in terms of, all right, a majority of people. Well, what's more fair? 10%, that if 10% of people are a net detriment on society, then we should outlaw it. What about 1%? Do you think that most people would be able to agree that if only 0.1% of a particular type of user is a detriment on society, that um, that it's okay, that it shouldn't be illegal?
I would hope so.
And I
Yeah,
realize that we're putting on percentages, but I think that 0.1% people would be able to agree with that, right?
I mean, 1 out of every 1,000 people is a detriment from this from using this substance, whereas 999 people that use it are
That's a
not a
pretty good
detriment.
success rate.
Yeah, I mean, look at general societal numbers. You'll probably find a much larger percentage of people that are considered a detriment on whatever metric than
Sure.
that.
The reason I bring it up is because I just feel like bringing in a completely unrelated argument of gun control. Should people be allowed to own guns? If 99 out of 100, or 999 out of 1,000 people own guns and have no crimes whatsoever committed with them, they're not being a detriment to
To
society.
to be fair to that point, and also to the point about drugs or anything,
Sure.
the level of detriment to society does matter. Someone being a detriment to society where they end up costing all taxpayers, like as a whole, 1,000 extra dollars a year is one thing, but someone with a guns going into a school and shooting up children is a much larger detriment that needs to be considered.
Which happens maybe once a year.
Still, it happens.
Sure. And also drunk driving. Drunk driving is one of the
And that's a
lead
very
causes
fair point.
of death besides
Right.
disease. So
Yeah.
drunk driving, people just getting drunk and stabbing another person or beating another person up or killing someone in some way. Cocaine, same thing.
hmm
Drugs that end up changing your perception of reality and increasing your ability to act regardless of inhibitions, uh, means that they are going to be a detriment to society. And even if it's 1 in 1,000 people that gets that gets drunk, ends up accidentally killing someone or uh, hitting them while drunk driving, 1 in 1,000. Okay, that's the number that we've been using. So it's very unlikely to happen, but it's a huge detriment because you can end up killing people. I think that we've covered this point fairly well, that drugs can have as negative effect as guns, and I bring the point up just because I found an interesting correlation. But let's talk about a slightly different topic: drugs around children.
Yeah. So using drugs, at, like using recreational drugs around children, whether they are legal or not, just the ramifications of doing so. And I think the age of the child doesn't matter, but let's just
I
say
think
prior.
using them around a child, it's very simple. If
Mhm.
you are a parent, or if the child is dependent on you in some way, and you're using drugs, you're changing your ability to, like we were saying earlier, your ability to interact with reality, which is changing the child's ability to be safe and to interact with reality, which means the child is, you can no longer say that they're arguably safe under your protection, and you can't really facilitate their growth into society. So you're actively harming the child, and it's a direct harm. So I think that detaching from reality in that way, in a way that is not recoverable, that if the child comes into the room and you can't reattach yourself to reality, you are affecting the child in a negative way, which, if that is negative, if affecting a child in a negative way is something that is to be avoided, then doing drugs that detach you from reality and don't allow you to reattach to reality is wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that detaching children from reality, so children taking drugs, them detaching themselves from reality, has the same thing. That they, the critical aspect of a child, and assuming that we accept the axiom that the point of a child's development to be good is to have them gain the ability to interact with the world,
Hmm.
and in a way that is positively interact with the world. If they're doing nothing but drugs, or if they're constantly and regularly detaching themselves from reality, that inhibits their ability to develop that interactability with reality,
Yeah.
then drugs should not be used by children.
I would agree with that. Yeah. The impact of many drugs on the mind of a child is much greater than the mind of an adult. So there's a study done that showed that the people that use marijuana frequently as an adult are tend to be much more of a, I'll use the same terminology we've been using, a much more of a detriment to society if they started using marijuana before the age of 21. Whereas if they
Yep.
started using it after 21, there's actually a very small chance that they would be a detriment to society.
So
So
how about this? And I'm just going to throw you for a loop, because you were saying that some drugs you can take once and have a positive effect.
mhm,
So if as a child you're more susceptible to that, you can have the same dose and have a larger positive effect or larger manipulative effect on your later interpretations of life. Now, I think there's an argument for that, that it could be good to give hallucinogenics to children because you want to expose kids to new ideas. Hear me out. Let
so
me finish. You
yeah,
want to
okay.
expose kids to new ideas, so hallucinogenics could be good to give to kids. I think the best argument against that is that we have no idea what the effects of that will be. And so the conservative aspect of most people would say, let's go with what we know and not get kids high off their balls.
Yeah, and there's an argument against that. I think when I think about someone trying LSD or psilocybin to expose themselves to new ideas, they already have a formed perspective and ideas on the world that a
Versus a
child wouldn't
child that does not.
otherwise
They're
have.
still developing the ideas.
Yeah,
And
and
it's
so you are directly interfering with their initial perspective building, whereas an adult doing one of those is like, I
so
have this perspective, I'll
should
get
children
another
not be
one.
exposed to religion?
That's a different argument.
You're exposing them to new ideas and new perceptions of the world.
So
So
it
are
is,
hallucinogenics.
but there is I guess I would make a distinction where you are giving them a consumable, something that you can't exit willingly and you can't
Ah,
just ignore.
so is forcing your child to go to church equivalent to forcing an edible on your child?
Potentially, depending on what's in the edible.
Because you're forcing them into a position that they don't want to be in,
Mhm.
and
Or may not, maybe they don't like. With church, it's easy to say a lot of kids don't like being there. If a kid is on drugs, they may like it, but it's not going to have it's not going to be a positive thing, potentially, most likely.
sure.
So there's
So,
a, I
so
mean,
what
there's
what's the
distinction
difference
there,
between
but
forcing a kid to go to church and forcing drugs on a kid? I mean, there's obviously the inability to reattach yourself to reality, and I think that that's the big
yeah.
aspect that we point out that is different between ideas as a change of perspective on
Mhm.
reality and drugs as a change of perspective on reality is the fact that drugs you can't just reattach yourself to reality, ideas you can, which I think
And
is which I
you
think is
can't
the
just
primary difference.
you can't just ignore a drug. You can ignore a preacher all day long. Uh,
Yeah.
so when you are high on drugs, you can't choose to suddenly not be high, and you can't choose to ignore what you are seeing or feeling. Like you can try to push it out, but no matter what, if you open your eyes and look around and you are on a psychedelic,
Or even
you
if you
are
close your eyes.
yeah, you very very well see things when you close your eyes there. But if you're in church, you have an ability to put either a mental block or some sort of block of incoming ideas. Like just the thought of not wanting to hear an idea, you're probably not going to hear it anyways. Like
Right, and that it
they're
won't
saying
affect
it
you.
right.
Ignoring an idea and hearing it but not internalizing it and mentally ignoring it is an effective way of no longer being affected by it. Drugs, you can't do that.
Yeah, you can't just turn it off. I mean, there are. I've definitely heard the argument by people that
If
are
you want
like,
to expose your kid to a particular religion and
mhm,
the kid has the ability to ignore it. If you
yep,
give your kid drugs, they don't have the ability to ignore it, and you are
yeah,
affecting their freedom of choice by doing so. You can
yeah,
force them to go to church. You can't force them to be a Christian
right.
or any
And
other religion for that matter.
there are definitely people I've experienced that will argue that point and say you can ignore a drug. Like if you're drunk and then something really serious happens, your friend gets really hurt and you need to drive them to the hospital, you can just ignore the drunkenness to get them to the hospital. And the answer is no, you
No.
can't. You might get like an adrenaline rush that feels like you're ignoring it, but no, you are still very much drunk.
So adrenaline legitimately can counteract um, some effects of some drugs temporarily, but it's not a full counteraction and it's very short lived. And also,
Yep.
particularly after adrenaline wears off, there is a massive down.
Yep.
Uh, so when you're in a drug trip, you're in the drug trip, and you are necessarily detached from reality. And I think that's the problematic aspect, that it
Mhm.
affects your ability to face problems, which, while it can be good, it can also be very detrimental to your ability to function as a normal human being when called upon or when it's necessary.
Mhm.
So while there isn't anything inherently wrong, the risks that you're posing to you of, number one, not being a contributing member of society, and number two, not being able to function anymore with reality and not being able to snap out of it, are the main negatives of recreational drugs that need to be taken into account by people who are able to consent in making the decision to take those drugs.
Yeah.
I,
I would generally agree.
I think so. And now,
Yeah.
we covered a lot of contentious topics like giving drugs to kids, but I think that's a fairly good point to end on. Is there
Mhm.
is, are there any other points that we've missed?
No, I think we've covered them all, in my
I
opinion.
I think we've covered
All
literally everything about drugs that we could possibly cover
yep. They're
until we discover
why
and remember what we missed in these past two episodes, and then we'll make a third about it.
just like we did with this episode is we weren't originally going to do a second drug episode, but after talking about it a bit outside and realizing we didn't cover everything, hey, we had enough for another episode. So who's to say that isn't going to happen? But until then, there's no use anyone talking about drugs ever again because we covered it all.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think that's it for now, and thanks for listening, everyone.
so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.